to attribute demonic capacities to me.
Yeah, exactly. Anyways, it's really lovely to have you here. Let me introduce you properly. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and you are listening to and or watching a podcast I do called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Matthew D. Taylor, who has done a lot of things that I have something to do with in the sense that our interests are similar. And we're going to be talking with Matthew about the work he does. We're kind of starting with an article that he and someone I've also interviewed here, Brad Onishi, wrote together for Rolling Stone on Mike Johnson. And I don't know who got quoted first. I know that we've talked about the article and the work. We also have a book coming out, so forth. So I'm going to read this introduction here, and then we'll dive in. But anyway, Matthew, welcome and thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's great. So Matthew is a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, co-author with our friend Brad Onishi of the Rolling Stone article, "The Key to Mike Johnson's Christian Extremism Hangs Outside His Office." We will be talking about that. I have the article to read out loud here and excerpts from it. Writer of Charismatic Revival Fury, an audio documentary series on the Christian leaders and the ideas that fueled the Capitol riot, produced by Brad Onishi. We're going to talk about that connection too. Author of The Violent Take It by Force, and this is a new book, as I understand it, coming out in September.
Yep.
Hopefully the title's not too prophetic.
Well, it is the words of Jesus.
September, October, November. Yeah, 3 months later, The Violent Take It by Force. Author of The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. And it's coming out in September. So the first thing I want to do is just a bit of housekeeping. And that is, the book sounds so interesting. And of course, I'm going to read it. I'm just wondering if I can get you to say you'll come back and help promote it here, because that would fit in well with what we do.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to come back for that.
Okay. So we're gonna, instead of trying to talk about it now, we're going to do it properly and just tell Ernie, Greg, our redoubtable producer, when it best fits you to come back and talk about that book, by which time I will have it read and annotated and properly prepared, and we will really discuss it.
Great.
So the other thing is, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, where I make various statements at frankschaeffer.substack.com. So let's get into the article, and I've got it right here. So I'm going to read a little bit from the article you wrote November 10, 2023. The key to Mike Johnson's Christian extremism hangs outside his office. The American public has had too much to learn about Mike Johnson over the past 2 weeks until his surprise has had much to learn about Mike Johnson over the past 2 weeks until his surprise elevation to House Speaker. The Louisiana representative was an obscure, mild-mannered, and bookish four-term backbencher. He is a formal constitutional lawyer and hardly the type of political figure who jeers during a State of the Union address or gets caught in a Beetlejuice groping scandal or shows up on cable news to take a victory lap after ousting the leader of his own party. Johnson is focused, methodical, and up until now was happy to operate behind the scenes. He's also a dyed-in-the-wool Christian conservative, and there's a flag hanging outside his office that leads into a universe of right-wing religious extremism as unknown to most Americans as Johnson was before he ascended to the speakership. Johnson slots firmly within the more hardline evangelical wing of the Republican coalition. He holds stringent positions on abortion, thinks homosexuality is a lifestyle choice that should not be recognized under legal protections against discrimination, defends young earth creationism, blames school shootings on the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and questions the framework of the separation of church and state. The founders wanted to protect the church from the encroaching state, not the other way around, he has said. Johnson was also integral to Donald Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election. As the New York Times has reported, he collected signatures for a brief supporting a Texas lawsuit alleging without evidence irregularities in election results, etc., etc. And you sort of make the case that I also made verbally with several of my "it has to be said" statements, and then talked about with various guests on this podcast that the general public, unlike you, is ignorant of the Reconstructionist theonomist movement going back to people like my father, Francis Schaeffer, in the 1970s, Rousas, Rushdoony's, and others. And to Mike Johnson, people like my dad, actually in particular my dad, but also Rousas Rushdoony, who talked about reestablishing biblical law, bringing America back to God. My father would be an obscure figure to most people in America even today, but to someone like Mike Johnson is seen as a prophet. My dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, called, if need be, for the overthrow of the U.S. government by force if needed to roll back Roe v. Wade. Rousas Rushdoony believed in slavery, that discrimination was rooted in biblical law all the way back to the time of Noah, etc. Most Americans would already have turned off hearing this, in the sense that it's like, this can't be possible. So what I first want you to do, Matthew, is tell us a little bit about yourself, because anybody who combines in their job title Judaism, Christianity, and Islam right now has a lot of work to do in the light of what's happening in Gaza and Hamas and Israel, let alone what's going on with Mike Johnson. I don't even know where to start. So, it's religion all the way down everywhere, from West Bank settlers to Hamas to Mike Johnson to American theocrats sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court. I mean, either you're the happiest person in America right now because all of a sudden your field of academic study is headlines every day, everywhere, somehow, or, you're ready to throw yourself off a cliff because everything you've been saying is coming true. Where would you like to begin, Mike? Matthew, I should say Matthew.
I guess I'm a little closer to the cliff these days. If those are my two options. So I grew up in an evangelical, kind of mainstream evangelical household in Southern California. Your dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, was definitely on my parents' bookshelf, and was read in our household. I was a little young for that. I was born in 1980, so I wasn't really accessing those things apart from through my parents or other communities that I was a part of. So you grew up in Southern California as an evangelical, even went to private Christian schools, and then went to the University of California, Irvine, and got involved in a campus ministry there, and even went into ministry for a while, went to seminary. And so I was very much an evangelical for the first 30 years or so of my life. And then it was actually, so I attended Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. And it was really at seminary that at an evangelical seminary, that I came to the conclusion I wasn't evangelical anymore. And there were theological reasons for that. There were personal reasons for that. This was around 2009, 2010. So this was long before Trump appeared on the scene. But I kind of migrated out of evangelicalism, in part because I really wanted to do interreligious dialogue. And I found that evangelicalism was a bit of a cul-de-sac intellectually, if you want to do interreligious dialogue. And I was especially interested in Islam. And so after finishing in seminary, I applied for PhD programs and went to Georgetown University, did my PhD there, and in Muslim-Christian relations. And my first book is about the movement that gets called radical Islam, Salafism. But I'm looking at the Salafi movement in the United States and how they experienced the post 9/11 world, and the way that the security state and Islamophobia come crashing down on them. And then what is remarkable, what the story I tell in the book, is about this really surprising evolution that occurs within Salafism. Salafism is a reform movement, a renewal movement within Islam, similar to evangelicalism in Christianity, that wants to take people back to the text, right? Take people back to scripture. But in the United States, in this post 9/11 world, this movement that many people would associate with terrorism and extremism has actually become quite pluralistic and quite integrated into American Islam, into Muslim communities, and even has become a bulwark against extremism in the Muslim community, and both in the US and around the world. And so I'm trying to tell that story of what does it look like for a movement that is fringe, that is imperiled, that is in many ways the victim of real discrimination, to integrate itself into the life of American pluralism. And so that's really kind of my theological background. And I sent the manuscript for that book off to the publisher the morning of January 6th, 2021. And I thought I was going to have a little bit of a calmer day. I'd been watching the news enough to know that January 6th was not going to be calm, but I was hoping that it would at least be a little intellectually calm for me. Then I was watching the Capitol riot that afternoon. And
who's going to be publishing The Violent Take It by Force? To just cut ahead a little bit, who's the publisher?
It's with Broadleaf.
Okay, Broadleaf is publishing it. Okay, good. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Okay, so back to the story.
So that set me on a new trajectory. I was here in Baltimore, but I had lived in DC for 6 years, and I love that city. I love those spaces where the riot was taking place. And so there's an element of heartbreak, but I was also seeing the Christian connections and seeing the Christian symbolism. And I had seen some of that burbling up in my own acquaintance networks and on social media. And so because I was in a bit of a hiatus, I couldn't do any more work on my book while it was being peer reviewed. I just started digging to try to understand who were the Christian leaders behind all of this, and became an entirely new research trajectory for me. And that's what Charismatic Revival Fury, the auto documentary series that I did, and then my new book is coming out of trying to understand what is Christian extremism, in my case, particularly charismatic Christian extremism in the United States looking like right now, and how did that contribute to January 6th, and how is that manifesting in our politics today?
Yeah, and it's sort of an odd coincidence that Mike Johnson was someone who was filing briefs in support of President Trump, so very much on the insurrectionist side of things, and now he's the Speaker of the House. So that, the way I would put it is looking back at the 70s and 80s when my dad and I were very much involved, me as his nepotistic sidekick, and he as this instigator of a kind of a Christian reconstructionism, milder than some of the people like Rushdoony, but nevertheless very much bring America back to God kind of mandate. At that point, we were really outsiders. We were just sort of a nuisance. We would meet with Ronald Reagan or the Bush presidents, and my father stayed in the White House a number of times with Gerald Ford and others, but they would suffer us because we represented a sliver of voters. And then, maybe next week they have a Jewish leader come in and talk to him because he represents a sliver of voters, but they'd never identified with us. For instance, Ronald Reagan was not pro-life. He was pro-choice. He legalized abortion in California. He simply made the switch, much to Nancy Reagan's horror, because she was ardently pro-choice, for political reasons, but we were outsiders. And I would just say the difference between your era and mine, I'm 71, going to be 72 in August, and you're whatever the math is from 1980, you're younger. But the idea, fast forward my life, that we would have seen a point where, in essence, quote unquote, we won, because not only were we not outsiders, the Supreme Court majority was made up of the kind of people we were calling for to be on the Supreme Court back at the beginning of the Federalist Society. The kind of vision we had of what a government should be doing is exactly what happened when Roe v. Wade was overturned. So it's odd for me. It's a sort of it's a Rip Van Winkle or whoever it was that went to sleep and woke back up again. I mean, here we are in the world that my father and I contributed to creating, and I'm trying to undo some of the damage we did. But where your work fits in is that you're beginning to pick up the story in your book, looking at the facts on the ground as I understand the book, and I've been reading about it. And then, of course, your article as well. You're dealing with the effect of how successful the evangelical invasion of the Republican Party and finally the takeover of the Republican Party by Christian nationalism. And so, where you pick the story up is kind of like, it just seems like a completely different moment of history than where I was involved in the religious right. So much so far-fetched at this point, because then you introduce Trump and he's this unimaginable figure to be leading evangelicals of all people, that it's almost like an out-of-body experience for me. It's just so odd looking at all this, in addition to being fraught because my grandchildren are going to be living in this world. It hardly seems possible. I mean, I never would have seen this trajectory. When I was your age or younger, the trajectory was that we're going to lose the culture to secular humanists. We've lost this battle. The culture war has been won by the left. We've lost it. And now all of a sudden, Amy Coney Barrett represents the future. and I'm like a dinosaur because I'm a liberal Democrat. And I just don't know how you see that trajectory now into the next step. I mean, we've got November coming up in the election. I mean, how do you see things now? We're talking to Matthew Taylor, who's written this article on Mike Johnson, but also written a whole book on the kind of evangelical invasion of American politics and what's happening. So what are you kind of predicting in the book, and how are you seeing things in terms of this trajectory?
Well, maybe if I could go back and narrate some of that trajectory, because I think it has its continuities, but it also has its ruptures and its discontinuities. And I think we need to pay attention to both of those, because the religious right today is actually quite different from what it was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, in the Reagan Revolution era. And I would argue it's quite a bit more dangerous even. And I think we see that in January 6th. We see that in these Christian Trumpian politics.
Yeah.
And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book, and also in Charismatic Revival Theory, this audio documentary series, is to narrate some of how these transitions occurred. And my argument is that there's a central movement that comes out of the more obscure parts of American Christianity that really grabs hold of this agenda and moves it forward in a particular way, but also changes the religious right in the process. So if we go back to the era of your dad, the era of Rushdoony, of Gary North, of the Reconstructionists, of Jerry Falwell, right? The Christian right is in many ways the Reconstructionists are Rushdoony and North, and there's a bunch of theologians who all get there. They're all Calvinists, right? And they're hyper Calvinists. They are very dedicated to a particular Calvinist Reformed vision of Christian theology. And what they started to realize, the Reconstructionists, especially in the 1980s, but starting in the 1970s, was that they're very systematic. They're very heady. They're very cerebral in their theology. And they started to realize, and I haven't seen your dad so much involved in this, much more, especially Gary North, but some of these other Reconstructionist leaders, they discovered that their ideas were not equally popular with everyone. Because again, it's all centered in this very hardened Calvinistic theological framework. But the idea that really caught on that they were talking about, so there still are Reconstructionists today, there still are these hyper Calvinists. Sure. But the idea that comes out of the Reconstructionists that really other people latch hold of is this idea of dominion and dominion theology. And so in the 1980s, some of these Reconstructionist reform leaders start going to other streams of Christianity, people that they might have even at the time considered to be heretics. But they recognized that there was a gravitational pull and popularity of these movements. And they were especially interested in charismatic Christians. And so there were a number of conferences that were held collaborating between what we would today call independent charismatics, so non-denominational folks who are Pentecostal in their spirituality, right? Have a Pentecostal style of spirituality, very ecstatic, very focused on the supernatural, very interested in spiritual gifts and speaking in tongues and prophecy, but are not denominational. Most Pentecostals in the US are denominational. So these are independent charismatic, kind of vague networks in the 1980s. And these ideas from the Reconstructionists start flowing into these networks. And there were a bunch of other ideas flowing into these networks. And out of these networks, a group of these leaders congeal in the 1990s, and they adopt the title the New Apostolic Reformation to describe their set of ideas. And they're blending together some of these charismatic theological streams with this Reconstructionist dominion stream. And the leader of this movement, or at least the one who is really kind of the inspiration for much of it, is actually a seminary professor at Fuller Seminary. His name is C. Peter Wagner. And Peter Wagner was, he's a mainstream evangelical in the 1980s. He's an expert in church growth and in trying to, his PhD was actually in social ethics. And he was trying to find ways to blend the data of sociology, the data of kind of the social sciences, blend that with evangelical theology to produce growth in missions movements, to produce growth in churches. And becomes fixated with these independent charismatics. He thinks that's where God is going to grow the church.
Mm.
And so it's in the late 1990s that he starts gathering, and he has this theory that he calls the New Apostolic Reformation. He sometimes also calls it the post-denominational church.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea is we're going to move past denominations. We're going to move past the bureaucracies and rigid structures of Christianity, and we're going to see a charismatic renewal of Christianity that will lead into a third great awakening, a global revival.
Mm-hmm.
And he also becomes convinced that the leaders of that, and this is more coming out of the charismatic side of the theology, the leaders of that will be a renewed set of apostles and prophets, that God will rebirth the offices of apostles and prophets that existed in the early church but have fallen out of Christian practice. God is going to anoint new apostles and new prophets. And Peter Wagner came to believe that he was one of these new apostles who was going to lead the church. This is why they call it the New Apostolic Reformation. They believed that they could instigate something in parallel with the Protestant Reformation, a new Reformation built around these apostolic and prophetic leadership ideas and these dominion ideas. And so he starts building a bunch of networks, low-grade networks. They didn't often even have an official institutional footprint. They were just kind of within Wagner's own circles. And thousands, or really hundreds, maybe even low thousands of leaders join up with these New Apostolic Reformation networks. And there's an inner core of leaders who are mentored by Wagner in that. When we fast forward to the Trump era and to January 6th, those New Apostolic Reformation networks formed the backbone of Christian Trumpism. They were the first leaders, the first Christian leaders to overtly endorse Donald Trump, and they were the key instigators and principal theological architects of the Capitol riot. And so my book is trying to understand how this happens, because in many ways, at least when I was growing up in evangelicalism, this New Apostolic Reformation stuff seemed very, very French. I mean, I think I first heard about it in 2008, 2009, and I thought, people who think they're modern day apostles and prophets, like, how's that ever going to catch on? The reality is, in charismatic circles, this has become an incredibly important force in the US and globally, this idea of apostles and prophets leading these new forms of church. And it's an extremely unregulated area as well, because it's non-denominational. And so there's very little accountability. There are very few checks and balances. And people are operating in this very high octane style of, I hear directly from God. I speak for God, right? And those apostles and prophets that Wagner mentored have become incredible celebrities in the charismatic media world. And today they are some of the most ardent defenders and propagandists for Donald Trump in Christian communities. And they are in many ways leading the charge, even now in the 2024 election, to see Trump have another term, right? And they've already got authoritarian tendencies built into their theology. And now they are manifesting those similar tendencies in our politics. And they have a very aggressive political vision built around dominion theology, but their own particular style of it.
Do they have any interaction with some of the people that your average American has heard of or did hear of at some point, like Ralph Reed or Franklin Graham, Paula White, these people who you saw in the pictures with him, or Ralph Reed, who basically gave him the list of people to nominate that he got from the Federalist Society, kind of made a deal with Trump, said, look, we'll help you get there in spite of your unsavory past, but here are the people we want on the Supreme Court. Or Franklin Graham, who came out and denounced the Republicans who did not support Trump after he was impeached. How did these sort of more, I won't call them mainstream because you're saying these people are mainstream, but the kind of more traditional evangelical power mongers like Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham, how have they participated with this movement?
It's actually an interesting story. And I think it hinges on Paula White, whom you mentioned.
Yeah.
Paula White is she's a Florida televangelist, comes from Mississippi. She actually came up in the Black Pentecostal world. She for a long time she's
white, just mentioned.
So Paula White, she's a white woman, grows up in Mississippi, born in Mississippi, grows up really in Maryland, but then she becomes an independent charismatic megachurch pastor. Right. And she and her second husband, Randy White, lead one of the largest megachurches in the country at the turn of the millennium. I mean, their church in Florida was one of the top 10 largest churches in the United States. And then she starts a televangelism career on Black entertainment television, is mentored by T.D. Jakes, But she became in the year 2001, she gets a call out of the blue from Donald Trump. And he had seen her, he'd watched her televangelism show when he was at Mar-a-Lago. And he called her and he said, you have the it factor. And her response, partially tongue-in-cheek, was, sir, we call that the anointing.
Yeah.
And she became his personal pastor, and she was doing this for a lot of celebrities at the time. She ministered to Michael Jackson when he was in the midst of some of his own sex scandals and pedophilia scandals. She was the personal pastor to Kid Rock, and even performed the wedding ceremony for Kid Rock and Pamela Anderson on a boat. So she was kind of doing this thing of being a celebrity pastor in addition to everything else. And Donald Trump kind of became one of those people that she would minister to and meet with and talk about spirituality. And so as Trump in 2015 declares that he is going to run for the presidency in June of 2015, he reaches out to Paula White and he says, I want you to be my bridge builder to evangelicals. Now, the problem for Paula White is she doesn't know traditional evangelicals.
Yeah,
she
and
also
she's had legal problems and embezzlement and things that she almost got arrested for. She is a persona non grata, if you want to put it this way, to the editorial board of Christianity Today magazine.
Absolutely. Yeah, and she has come up in this non-denominational charismatic world that is in many ways laughable to traditional evangelicals, right? The old school religious right saw this as the fringe. They saw this as the weirdo zone, right?
Yeah.
And Paula White herself, she has been very influenced by the word of faith movement, which we would call the prosperity gospel, right? And so she has even been called a heretic by many of the conventional leaders of the religious right. But she is the one that Donald Trump empowers to be his liaison to evangelicals. And so what Paula White starts to do, and this starts in the fall of 2015, and she starts organizing gatherings of Christian leaders to meet with Donald Trump. And she's drawing from her relational circles. She's drawing from these independent charismatics. She's drawing in messianic rabbis and apostles and prophets and televangelists and megachurch pastors. And these are some of the first leaders, the Christian leaders, to meet with Donald Trump. And what happens, though, is and you have this divide that goes on, especially in 2015, where the grassroots evangelicals support Donald Trump. You can see this in the polls. He's always winning. I mean, he's not always getting more than 50%. There's like 13 candidates, but he's always in the lead among the Republican candidates with the evangelical voters.
Yeah.
But the evangelical elites, the Christianity Today types, they don't want anything to do with Trump. And so these independent charismatic celebrity types, like like Paula White, like some of these NAR apostles and prophets, they become the new elites who are supporting Donald Trump.
Well, and they have the numbers and the money. You know, back in the day, I remember when I spoke at Oral Roberts University, and I knew Oral and his son Richard. In those days, they were the unwashed charismatics that mainstream evangelicals like Billy Graham avoided because they were just too crazy. You know, and they were having these visions and so forth. And Paula White and the people you're describing sound to me anyway, very much like they come from that stream. And now, of course, it's a much bigger time thing because they have a presidential candidate.
Yes. And so then what happens in the course of the 2016 primary is Donald Trump starts winning all these primaries.
Sure.
It becomes clear that he's going to be the nominee. And suddenly the James Dobsons and the Ralph Reeds and the Franklin Grahams, who didn't want to touch Donald Trump with a 10-foot pole the previous fall, are now coming hat in hand. And they're trying to get access to Trump because they know he'll be the nominee. And who's the gatekeeper? Paula White.
Yeah.
And so there's an inversion of power that goes on, where these people who were previously marginal and fringe are now at the center of the action.
Yeah.
And that changes the religious right. It changes it in its tone. It changes it in its spirituality. And you start to see this integration of charismatic leadership, charismatic spirituality, charismatic theological paradigms, charismatic practices into the religious right. And you can find these videos of these charismatic prophets, some of them who are brought in officially in these meetings, some of them who become some of Trump's evangelical advisors, literally prophesying over Donald Trump, speaking words of prophecy to him personally. And he's sitting there just kind of receiving it and accepting I mean, they're always positive prophecies, right? Nobody's ever denouncing him prophetically. And so it becomes this sort of echo chorus in the charismatic world. And the NAR leaders are integral to this. In fact, one of the major NAR leaders is a guy named Lance Wallnau.
Just say NAR again. Tell us.
NAR, yeah, New Apostolic Reformation.
Okay, that's what I
And
wanted.
and one of the major NAR leaders is Lance Wallnau,
Right.
who he was the one who came up with this new version of Dominion theology that is called the Seven Mountain Mandate.
Yeah, and we want to go there, by the way. So just pause now. Since you've mentioned it, I had a note here from my producer, Ernie, to get you to go here. So let's just jump into the Seven Mountain Mandate for a minute. Talk about that, and also talk about how they inaccurately, by the way, seem to, a lot of the writings on this reference my dad's work as if somehow he created this, which he did not. And by the way, he would not have liked Trump at all. And would, unlike Franklin Graham and Ralph Reed, would never have gone hat in hand to be part of this. And I know that because of the way he resisted having his picture taken with Ronald Reagan and so forth. He just didn't go there. But that said, talk about the Seven Mountain thing for a minute, and then let's get back into this story you're telling.
Well, let me tell you the story of how your dad got roped into it, actually.
Yeah, well, that's interesting.
So in 1975, there were two evangelical leaders who were both in Colorado, and they had set up to have dinner. And the two men were Lauren Cunningham, who was the founder of Youth with a Mission, which everyone calls YWAM.
Right.
And then Bill Bright.
Yeah, both of whom I knew, by the way, when I was growing up.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. They definitely ran in your circles.
And Bill was a weird pecker. Let me just tell you something. If you had said to me, what are the strangest 6 people you've ever met? He'd right on the top of that list.
So Bill Bright was the one who created Campus Crusade, which is now called Cru.
Yes.
And so they've set up to have dinner. They don't actually know each other that well. It's actually as far as I can reconstruct, it was a shared donor who kind of gave a shotgun marriage and said, like, you guys need to have dinner. But the day before or the night before they meet, Lauren Cunningham believes he has a vision from God. Because again, he's charismatic, and so he believes he has this vision from God, and God tells him there are 7 spheres of society that you need to do, that you need to use to disciple nations. And so he kind of comes up with this schema of there's these 7 areas. It's the church, it's government, it's education, right? Kind of different sectors of society. Right. And when he gets together with Bill Bright, at least the mythology is that Bill Bright, before Lauren can whip out his list of 7 things and share this new revelation, Bill Bright pulls out a sheet of paper, and he had gotten the same vision the night before. Now, again, how much of that is mythology and legend? How much of that's real? It's been told many, many times. But then the thing, in the way at least Lauren Cunningham tells the story, a few days later, after they've gotten really excited about this list of 7 sectors of society, they call them the 7 spheres of influence, or the 7 mind molders of culture. Cunningham's wife, Darlene, was watching your dad on television and heard him say something that sounded like this list of 7. And then they claimed that Frank Schaeffer had also verified their views, and that they were now they now had, or excuse me, Francis Schaeffer had affirmed their vision. And so I don't think they ever even actually talked to him about it. He was entirely by osmosis. They heard him on television and said, oh, he must.
Well, he would always talk about the lordship of Christ over the whole of life. And that's why we were having arts festivals at Libri Fellowship, his ministry. That's why we had poetry and music weekends. That's why we had political leaders coming to talk to him, like Jack Kemp, who was a congressman at the time, and later Bob Dole's vice presidential candidate. Mike Ford, the president's son, lived at Libri for a year. Now he's a pastor somewhere. So where they're correct is that my dad would talk about affirming Christian principle and going back to a Reformation base. He talked about, the Dutch Reformation and so forth, and the influence of culture. And he would talk about the arts and politics and the law and so on. And also a lot of guys at the Heritage Foundation would draw on this from my dad. And so did the people at the Federalist Society, because Dad would go talk to lawyers and say, listen, people will tell you to be a missionary or a pastor. Forget that. Become an artist, become a politician, become a lawyer, spend 30 years in the system, and eventually wind up a Supreme Court justice. We have to work within the system to take it back. So Dad did talk about this in pieces, though he never came up with any phrase like Seven Mountain, just to set the record straight.
But these ideas were out there, right?
And very much so. And they were his ideas. That's what we were talking about.
But then Cunningham had kind of integrated them into some of his YWAM trainings and things, but they were kind of obscure for most of the rest of the 20th century. And then in the year 2000, Lance Wallnau, this kind of washed up charismatic pastor in Rhode Island, meets Loren Cunningham at a conference and hears about these ideas directly from Cunningham, and hears about these dreams that they had. And Wallnau had just heard as well about a near-death experience that somebody had had, where they had a vision of 7 mountains coming out of the ocean, and God said, that's the government mountain and you're supposed to go into it. And the guy comes back from his near-death experience. And so Wallnau takes this near-death experience vision, blends it with this 7 spheres idea, and creates a new prophecy called the 7 Mountain Mandate.
Yeah.
And then shortly after that, Wallnau meets Peter Wagner, and Peter Wagner draws Wallnau. Peter loves these ideas, and he draws Wallnau, and then becomes a mentor to Wallnau, and then platforms these 7 Mountain Mandate ideas, and becomes integrated into the New Apostolic Reformation. It becomes in many ways their political theology. Is we need to conquer these things. Now, there's a shift though, and this is very, very important, because I think it's about it really is the shift from that early era of the Christian right and the Reconstructionist era into this more aggressive era that we're living in now. Because what Cunningham was talking about was spheres of influence, right? And how do you influence a sphere of influence?
Right, exactly.
It's non-directional. You just go into it, right? You just try to be inside the sphere and influence it. But mountains are directional, right? People control tops of mountains.
Yeah, yeah.
And Wallnau really leans into this and starts saying, no, we need to take over the tops of the mountains and then let Christian influence flow down.
Yeah.
And so what I think for Cunningham and for Bright, and I would argue probably for your father as well, it was more of an idea of grassroots mobilization.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
It was like we need Christians to go be involved in government and be involved in voting, be involved in education from the ground up, and that will change society slowly.
Well, and the big push then, and the big difference that my dad did and can be credited with or not, however your point of view is, was that he urged people to get out of what he called just simple evangelism, that it wasn't enough to get someone to say, I believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God and my Savior. Fine, great. But now what are you going to do with it? How about you become the next Pablo Picasso and influence the direction of Western art? How about you become a Supreme Court justice? How about you run for the Senate and win? How about you run for the presidency? And so where Dad had a big influence was in taking this kind of Reconstructionist doctrine and challenging younger people to mold their lives, not on the basis that somehow to be a missionary was a higher calling, to be a pastor was a higher calling. And I actually was with him at various speaking events when he would say, no, I don't want you to go to seminary. We don't need more missionaries. We don't need more people to accept Jesus. What we need is to change the Supreme Court, become a lawyer. That's where he challenged people. And the same with art and politics. And I think, he would have not liked any of these people. He was very dubious about the charismatic movement. He would have had an allergic reaction to Paula White, probably, the same as he had when he got to know Pat Robertson well after being on the 700 Club a lot. He really did not like what he called these people. And but the influence came, and this is a point that you will get, and a lot of people won't understand, particularly in the media these days, was that there was a before and after where the big knock on evangelicals in the 50s and the 60s was their apathy. All you want to do is go to church and have prayer meetings and preach the gospel. Billy Graham presented himself as non-political. And the big change was when Francis Schaeffer comes along and says, no, we have to be involved in the whole culture. And then these people built on that. I just want to interject that. Yes, continue.
No, and absolutely. And I'm not saying that Cunningham was this totally moderate guy, right? These guys really did have a religious right agenda. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
But the method was grassroots.
Yes, of course. And my dad too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is what I grew up with, right?
Yeah.
That Christian nationalism, what we call Christian nationalism today, in the rise of the religious right, was the energy was channeled into democracy. But what Wallnau is saying in the early third millennium, right, in the 2000s, he's saying, no, we need to do a top-down takeover of society. We need to take over the tops of the mountains, and then because those tops of the mountains, the key positions of influence in society, are either ruled by Satan or by the kingdom of God.
Right.
And so we need to take over. It's a vanguard model of societal transformation where you take over key positions of influence, and then let that influence flow down into the rest of society.
Yeah, and I
And
want to
so,
interject one footnote there and then continue.
sure.
And I noticed when this was happening that, just like God calls you to be rich, he calls you to be famous, he calls you to, somehow, I only own a private jet because I feel the Lord wants me to use my time wisely, this kind of thing. By the way, I do not own a private jet.
Me neither.
But similarly, it was a nice call because it was like, hey, you need to run that. We're not calling you to be a humble grassroots worker. We're calling you to take a top position, go to Washington, work with leaders, go to Hollywood, work with movie stars, become a movie star, use your influence. That's a nice call. It feeds ego, it feeds ambition, and it means that, it's Paula White talking to Donald Trump. She's working with presidential candidate and now a president. That's a nice call. That's better than running a soup kitchen. Just want to interject that. It follows the money trail as well, and the personal profit and the nepotism, because we hire everybody, including our not too bright cousin who, has access to the jet. People don't get that aspect either, the kind of con artist part that fits so well with Donald Trump. I mean, really, his model of operation through his business life really fits the Paula White model of how you engulf and devour in the name of Christianity as well. The charismatic movement always seemed to have a very greedy edge to it with the faith healers and all the rest of it. I don't want to detract from what you're saying, but just say, this was a marriage made in heaven, because Trump and these people fit together really, really well.
Yeah. And I would say that this Dominion theology and Reconstructionist theology in general, and then especially this charismatic version of it around the Seven Mountains and apostolic and prophetic paradigms, has been very good at baptizing people's personal ambition.
Yeah.
And clothing it in the garb of spiritual endeavor.
And it used to be called the prosperity gospel. And of course, that was the sort of thing Donald Trump believed in or pitched for himself. Trump University was a prosperity gospel ministry in all but name.
And that's what Paul White came up in, was the prosperity gospel, right? And so, but then Lance Wallnau, the same guy who came up with this idea, and this idea is everywhere today, the Seven Mountain Mandate has become incredibly popular in around the world. But he is in some of these meetings in the fall of 2015 that Paula White invites him in. And he claims in these meetings that he gets another prophecy, that he has a vision that Donald Trump will be the 45th president, and that is correlated to Isaiah 45, which is a passage about Cyrus, the king of the Persians. Mm-hmm. So Lance Wallnau claims that God speaks to him in these meetings with Trump and says that Donald Trump is a type of a Cyrus. Remember, Cyrus is the Persian emperor who sends the Jews back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem. And so Wallnau is playing out this prophetic analogy and saying, we as conservative Christians are living in cultural exile, and Donald Trump is anointed by God, and Cyrus is a messianic figure in the Hebrew Bible, right? He's an anointed one. And so anointing is the word Messiah, right? And so he's an anointed, chosen figure to fulfill a role in delivering conservative Christians from cultural exile. And this idea that Wallnau starts articulating in the fall of 2015 becomes one of the central rationales for evangelical supporting Donald Trump. And built into that idea is an acknowledgement that Donald Trump is not a good Christian, right? Because Cyrus was not Jewish.
Yeah.
He was a heathen emperor, a warrior king, anointed for a purpose of God's people, even though he was not one of God's people, right? And so there's an implicit acknowledgement. Donald Trump is not a good Christian, but he can be our bastard to take on the forces that we see as our
God can still use him. Let me just reintroduce you a second here. You are listening to or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is Dr. Matthew D. Taylor, who is a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, co-author with our friend Brad Anishi of a Rolling Stone article, The Key to Mike Johnson's Christian Extremism Hangs Outside His Office. And that's about a flag and a whole bunch of other stuff. But what we're talking about now fits in a way perhaps better with a book that's coming out in September, the author of The Violent Take by Force, the Christian Movement That Is Threatening Our Democracy. And it's coming out in September, and we're going to have you back again to talk about that. Let me make a quick jump out of this because we're talking about the charismatic movement. And I think that for two things, and I want you to address, you don't have to address it, but I'd like you to think about talking about how these connect. on the charismatic Christian side, I think there was a kind of a liberal white assumption that brown people coming over the border would kind of tend to vote for Democrats because, unlike Trump, they weren't being accused of being rapists and criminals, and there wasn't that element of racism there. Turns out that about a third of Hispanics in this country now are voting for Trump or say they will. And I think that is because the media, what we used to call the secular media when I was in the Christian circles, the media, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and so forth, don't have a handle on what you're saying. And so when they hear that many Hispanics are charismatic Christians, they don't understand there's a huge connection, aside from the Roman Catholic conservatism, into the Republican side of the Christian nationalist culture war. And I'd like you to talk about that. And then another project beside the Seven Mountain one, which kind of runs commensurate with it on a much bigger scale in terms of billionaire fundraising behind it. And that's the 2025 project that is being run by people like the Heritage Foundation, where they're taking tens of millions of dollars and plowing it into planning for a future Trump presidency and how they will deconstruct the federal government, including Social Security and Medicare, by the way, and roll it back to a kind of pre-Franklin Roosevelt Americanism, combining with this evangelical, charismatic army of people, Paula White's people. So I just want to say there's three things going on here that, in terms of putting Trump back in the White House, threaten America and democracy, literally. One is charismatic Christians that look for an authoritarian sort of monarchist vision of history, which is not anything to do with constitutional democracy, let alone the rule of law. It's all visions of God and how he will triumph through his leaders. It's no accident they look at Trump as a King Cyrus, because they'd rather have a king appointed by God than all this inconvenience like rule of law crap that they don't buy into. The 2025 project, run by the Heritage and other people, putting together hundreds of millions of dollars of dark money coming from people now into these 501c3 and C4 organizations that do not have to report who their donors are, literally preparing a government in waiting, a shadow government, to come in and replace federal employees down to mid-level positions with Trump loyalists. And then this kind of misunderstanding of the Hispanic, and I would say a lot of the Black church as well, in terms of its cultural conservatism, which is completely now buying into a vision of Trump as Cyrus to redeem America by making it a less sinful place, roll back gay rights, roll back women's rights, roll back the right to choose, basically push America back in a direction that would have been very comfortable with the people who settled the place where I'm sitting, which is north of Boston, which back in 1639, for instance, was conveying witches to their trials in Salem, tied to the back of ox carts, and they would be whipped in every town they went through in preparation for their execution as agents of Satan. Okay, that's a long preamble, but I think you're the best person to go there. So take it away.
So let me tackle the Christians of color question first. So we hear a lot of talk these days about white Christian nationalism,
right,
and this intersection of white identity and Christian identity. I think that's a real thing. I mean, you can see it in the numbers. There
sure,
really is such a thing as white Christian nationalism, but it's not the only kind of
yeah,
Christian nationalism. And I think we need to start having more sophistication in how we talk about the different species of American Christian nationalism, because they're not all the same.
no,
And this thing we call white Christian nationalism tends to predominate, as far as I can tell, where white Christians are dominant culturally. There are a lot of places in this country where there's all kinds of Christians. In fact, about 25% of the US population is Christians of color. Right? So if we're only talking about white Christian nationalism, we're only capturing one dimension of Christian nationalism. And the independent charismatic arena is one of the most multi-ethnic Christian spaces in the United States. And it's multi-ethnic and it's transnational, which means it's both ethnically diverse internally in the United States, but it's also tied into vast networks of charismatic leaders and charismatic communities all over the world. And so a lot of times where you have immigrant communities who come to the US, they're often bringing their charismatic spirituality with them.
From Africa or South America or Central America, wherever.
or South Asia, Southeast Asia. I mean, the charismatic spirituality, and especially this independent charismatic style of it, is one of the fastest growing religious movements in world history.
Yeah.
Right. And so globally, and to the degree that in 1970, the estimates are there were about 40 million non-denominational charismatic Christians in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As of 2020, it was over 300 million.
Yeah.
Right. So this exponential growth in this area of Christianity means that charismatic spirituality is moving across the U.S. border in both directions.
Sure.
Right? And so what actually happens is these independent charismatic folks, most of the Christians of color who became advisors to Donald Trump in his evangelical advisory circles were apostles and prophets from the independent charismatic world.
Yeah.
And so it's an evolution of Christian nationalism that is more multi-ethnic and is tied into charismatic spirituality and charismatic theology that is not attached to whiteness per se. Right. And it's a complicated story. And there's still racism in these circles. I'm not trying to say like, oh, and these are multiracial, harmonious communities. There's still racism in these communities, but it's complicated. Sure. And it's a different kind of racism than what you'll find in a white Southern Baptist church in the South. Right.
Well, and I think a lot of white people in the chattering class, the kind of folks I talk to in university sometime when I speak and so forth, hardly know these folks even exist.
Yes.
Nor do they get the fact that there are a lot of brown and black people out there who are more culturally conservative on issues liberals care about than they are dedicated to the issues that white liberals imagine black people and people of color are interested in. You know, you're a lot less likely to see a Black Lives Matter sign on the lawn of some of these charismatic folks as you are a sign related to abortion or gay marriage. If I'm not saying literally a sign, but to take that as a kind of an analogy, I think, and you can address this or not, but I think you butt up against a kind of fallacy in the white liberal community, which itself deals in not exactly the template of demonic versus anything else, but somehow gives a pass to very bad ideas that come out of what they still would call a minority community attached to a white community. It's a lot easier for my liberal friends on the North Shore near Boston here, the sort of Harvard, MIT crowd, the Volvo driving, higher education worshiping Northeast. It's a lot easier for them to talk about Christian nationalism if they give it a white framework. What they don't want to admit is they're losing the Hispanic vote to Donald Trump.
Yeah. In fact, the Public Religion Research Institute, they've done a survey the last 2 years on Christian nationalism in different communities. And it was very, very striking because in 2023, when they released their numbers, obviously white evangelicals front of the pack on Christian nationalism, like it's around 66% of people on the kind of Christian nationalist part of the spectrum among white evangelicals. But right behind them were Hispanic Protestants. They don't actually do Hispanic evangelicals. They just say Hispanic Protestants. Yeah. There's 43% in 2023 of Hispanic Protestants were also leaning towards the Christian nationalist side of the spectrum. In 2024, they just released new data a few weeks ago. That number jumped from 43% to 55% among Hispanic Protestants. Right. So yes, these Christian nationalism messages are resonating with communities of color. Yeah, many communities of color, Asian American, African American, especially Latino and Latina communities. Yeah. And so, and there are leaders in those communities who are embracing these things. In fact, when Donald Trump went to launch his Evangelicals for Trump 2020 campaign, which was sort of the religious adjunct to his larger campaign, he did it at the church of one of his advisors, a man named Guillermo Maldonado, who is a New Apostolic Reformation apostle who leads a bilingual megachurch in Miami of about 15,000 people. That half their services are in Spanish and half are in English. And that same apostle, Guillermo Maldonado, leads a network of churches spread all over the world, but especially in Latin America, that has like 500 churches that all look to him as his apostle, as their apostle. So he is not simply thinking about American politics, right? Guillermo Maldonado is what I would call a transnational Christian supremacist, right? He wants to enact the Seven Mountains. He wants to have Christians take over every society.
Mm.
And for him, he happens to be located in the United States, but his networks and his relationships are global, and his connections and his agenda is global. And the US is just one part of that. And Trump is just one part of that. And that is true for many of the people who surrounded Trump. They are not simply Christian nationalists in the sense that they care about transforming American culture. They are Christian supremacists whose hope is to transform every culture around this Christian agenda.
Yeah, I want to just check here something. Transnational Christian Supremacist is a good title for your third book on this subject. Hey, I want to alert Ernie to something here, my producer, and that is I think I'd like to go a little longer with this conversation if you're not butting up right against something here.
I've got some time.
Matthew, can I grab you for a while? Because there's too much here to talk about, and I don't want to do one of these things where we'll say, we must have you back. I want to go for it. As Ernie just said, go for it. 2 exclamation points. So that's like 2 thumbs up from my redoubtable producer. But I want to jump into something that continues to widen this, and that is that it seems to me that we're in a moment of history where we have so many mirror images of this kind of worldwide push toward one form of theocracy or another. So we've got the rise of Hindu nationalism right now, where Modi is turning India into a Hindu nationalist state on purpose. Persecution of Muslims, crimes against women from Christian minorities not being prosecuted unless they become, go viral. You've got Iran sitting out there, doing what Iran has been doing for a long time. The Saudis are unrepentant, sport washing themselves into the world of, more civil discourse, but still torturing political prisoners who go against whatever their Sharia laws are there. But it's happening in Europe. They pushed back a little in Poland. I don't need to tell you all what's going on or why Christian white nationalists have been going to talk to Viktor Orban in Hungary and so on. I just want you to take this thing of I want you to help me make a jump from what you're talking about in terms of charismatic Protestantism as opposed to evangelicalism, which is transnational, multiracial, multi-ethnic, cross-cultural, all the stuff liberals want to do, they're actually doing. And I'd like you to show me the mirror image, because you also are a student of Islamic studies, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a worldwide Christian-based caliphate is still a caliphate. It's not a series of democracies. And it just seems to me that, we're in a time when the predictions in 1960 that it would be basically secularism all the way down and Darwin was going to win and, Christians were going to be this minority and so forth. And then one other little thing I'm going to throw on your plate here to make it even more complicated, because you study both Christianity and Judaism and Islam, these kind of mirror image visions of various kinds of caliphate theocracies, the worldwide push even in Hindu nationalism. And then one other thing, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it seems to me that, again, a lot of more secular commentators have not realized until fairly recently that the kind of unmitigated support for the state of Israel in the United States was as much part of a white Christian Zionist nationalism, Hagee and others, that had far more interest in Israel as a prophetic symbol than in actually the welfare of individual Jewish people anywhere. And again, all this is suddenly headline shit now, but you were just trying to do nice academic studies, and all of a sudden, you're writing the headlines. So write some here and explain this to us, because somehow this is all happening at the same time. And wow.
The world has intruded upon my academic studies.
Yeah, I mean, you were just going to get a PhD and write a book.
So, all right, let me. I have an hour to answer that.
You have as long as you want. Let's just keep talking until the election on November 5.
So let me try to describe. Let me start here. Religious nationalism is a thing that you find. It's a phenomena that occurs across religious traditions, right?
Yeah.
And religious traditions often emerged not always in contexts of pluralism. They often emerged where one tradition could become dominant over time. And so this is why you have words like Christendom,
Yeah.
right? The domain ruled over by Christian empires, right? Physical territory controlled by Christians. And yet, as the world is globalized, as we have an international system, as there's migration, that we as we have even the evolution of democracies, right? Now we're in a different situation where there aren't religious empires per se anymore. And so there's always a complicated relationship between religion and state, because religion is not a dimension of human experience and expression that wants to be relegated to one sector of people's lives, right? Because religion is about making meaning in the world. It's about understanding the world in this big cosmic story. And that it's a way of integrating all kinds of different aspects of who we are. And so for a lot of people, they don't want to just be citizens of a secular democracy. They want to see a cosmic story that makes sense of their national belonging. And that's true for Hindu nationalists, that's true for Islamists, that's true for religious Zionists, that's true for Buddhist nationalists in Sri Lanka or Myanmar, right? There's a sensibility of I want the stories to all make sense together. And that's the seedbed for religious nationalism in the modern world. So it's not surprising that we would see all these complicated interfaces. And we are living in a moment right now, and you could have economic theories, you can have cultural disruption theories, there's all kinds of theories about why this is, but we are living in a moment right now where religious nationalisms are growing. Including forms of Christian nationalism, not only in the United States, and Brazil and Hungary and Russia, right? There are many forms of Christian nationalism, and we have a particular set of styles of Christian nationalism in the United States. But some of those forms of Christian nationalism are being inspired not by nationalistic ideologies, by supremacist ideologies. So let me make that distinction, right? Nationalists care about their nation. They are deeply invested in the project of shoring up the boundaries of the us that is their nation. And they care deeply about borders and making sure that those borders, whether those borders are conceptual, we are a white Christian nation, or whether those borders are literal, right? The southern border is our boundary, and we need to defend that boundary, right? That is the impulse of nationalism. But even in the way that we talk about white nationalism, but there's also a movement of white supremacy. I think we need to have that same distinction in our conversation about religious nationalism, because white supremacy is an ideology that is transnational. White supremacists may get involved in nationalist politics, but white supremacists want to create societies where white people are privileged over other kinds of people, because they believe white people are better than other kinds of people. And Christian supremacists want to create societies, not just their nation, but other societies as well, where Christians are privileged over other kinds of people. And Christianity is privileged over other kinds of worldviews, because that is, they believe, a mandate from God. They believe that they are that God instructs them. This is their interpretation of Jesus and of the Bible, that is what they are supposed to do, right? And so that they tend to network with other Christian supremacists. So let me just give an example. A little over a year ago, almost exactly 2 years after the U.S. Capitol riot on January 6, 2021, there was a Capitol riot in Brasilia. It was also led by Christians using Christian spirituality. In fact, many of those Christians were Pentecostal and charismatic, some of them tied into the same apostolic networks that gave rise to the January 6th Capitol riot, right? Some of the same leaders who were backing Donald Trump in the US were heavily backing Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. In fact, meeting with Bolsonaro and helping to backstop and theologically support Bolsonaro, and then helping to inspire this other Capitol riot. Now, not all those people were white, right? And so if we only think about whiteness and race within our own kind of U.S. context and U.S. paradigms, we will tend to default to U.S. understandings of race. But race is complicated around the world, right? And every society has these complicated layers of identity that correlate around class and race and socioeconomic status and gender and all these different dimensions of human existence. And so I think we do need to just be cognizant of the global context in which we're having this conversation. And yes, there are vast networks of transnational, especially charismatic, but not only charismatic, Christian communities that all have this agenda of Christian supremacy, that share that agenda and see it as theological and built into their spirituality, right? And so somebody like Guillermo Maldonado, this apostle who hosts Donald Trump's Evangelicals for Trump campaign kickoff and who's a close advisor to Trump, well, he has a transnational agenda, right? And he's willing to operate in coalition with white Christian nationalists in the United States because he has a broader agenda globally, right? And I think we just need to give people the credibility that they are agents themselves. It's not that Guillermo Maldonado is not a victim, an instrument of white Christian nationalists, and he's also not some puppet master. He is an actor making political choices alongside other actors making political choices, and see this as part of their agenda. So I think we need to be cognizant of that context, because otherwise you can't understand some of what's going on and some of the divides that occur within the Christian nationalist spectrum. Because a lot of Christian nationalists in the United States, it's not an agenda for them. It's hazy sentimentalism. It's nostalgia. They want America to feel more Christian. And then when you try to pin them down, you say, okay, well, you don't believe in separation of church and oh, no, I believe in separation of church and state. Okay, so you want legislators to use the Bible to make law? No, come on, no. I just wanted to be about Christian values. Well, what Christian values? I don't know, like love. Okay, fine, right? That's no great threat to democracy if you just want there to be more love in our politics. Whatever. That's a form of Christian nationalism, I guess, but it's not a danger to me. The folks I study have a deep anti-democratic agenda, and they have a theology that is built around that, and a spirituality that is built around that. It's a spirituality that we see on January 6th in things like these appeal to heaven flags, if you want to talk about Mike Johnson and some of the symbolism around his office, right? And that agenda has attached itself to Donald Trump. And it is deeply authoritarian, and it is radicalizing millions of Christians in the United States. People who might be those hazy, sentimental Christian nationalists are getting pulled into Christian supremacy, radicalized by these ideas, and adopting this overt agenda of societal takeover.
What do you think the interface with those folks, both brown, black, people of color, because we're widening this here, from that charismatic agenda would be with a second Trump term? And that's part one of a question. And what is it about that theology in particular, say, as distinct from my father's Reformed Calvinist theology, which lauded the influence of the French movement that came through people like Calvin and Farel in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, and in Holland, these theologians, Duvervier and others, that my dad liked in terms of just their good influence on the formation of democracy and individual rights and every man's access to the Bible, and as a kind of an underpinning to democratic values. What is it about this charismatic movement that interfaces so completely with this authoritarian model? What is their theological basis for being anti-democracy? And what would they see in its place? In the best of all worlds, if they could push a button right now and make it the way they want it, where would they want to be living? I mean, is it Iran? Is it Saudi Arabia with a different religious thing? Is it an authoritarian fascism? I mean, what do they see as the model of this nation-state worldwide movement of charismatic Christianity, reforming human life on earth in a non-democratic way? What is their ideal, and how do they get there theologically?
Again, we've got an hour, right? So let me start. Let me talk about the New Apostolic Reformation, because I think I can be much more specific, because the independent charismatic theology, huge,
sure,
right?
Sure, but this particular
and there are a lot of strands of this. I mean, you can talk about kind of a word of faith. How do you get there from the prosperity gospel, which most of the word of faith movement is really glommed onto Trump, but for the NAR, it's more particular, and I think there are three dimensions to their theology that really tie in closely with Donald Trump. One is they have developed a very robust and very belligerent vision of spiritual warfare.
Mm.
And the idea of spiritual warfare, right, is the idea that there are angels and demons all around us, and that Christians can participate in the battle between these angels and demons through prayer, through worship, through Christian spiritual practices, through devotional Bible reading, right? That we interface with this broader cosmic combat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very common idea among evangelical, Pentecostal, even some Catholic Christians. But the NAR and Peter Wagner take this and ramp it up to the highest level, and with what Peter Wagner called strategic level spiritual warfare, which is the idea that not only is that a personal thing that people participate in, or a communal thing, like my church can kind of do this warfare,
Mm-hmm.
but we need to organize campaigns of Christians to do spiritual warfare on a global scale, to displace what Wagner called territorial spirits. What he is his interpretation of Ephesians chapter 6, where it talks about the powers and principalities. And he said, no, there are territorial spirits, these demons who control literal physical territory. And we need to displace the territorial spirits in every nation so that the gospel can go forward and so that the church can reign triumphant. Right? And then this gets integrated into the seven mountains ideology, right? And that will be the second piece, right? Is then if you're doing spiritual warfare to conquer the seven mountains of society, to conquer the government, to conquer the education mountain, to conquer the media mountain, then you are taking the ideas of spiritual warfare, these things that are happening in the spiritual realm, and you're letting them play out in real life, in politics, and in movement agendas, in local school board meetings, in local city council meetings, right? Because the warfare is not only spiritual anymore. And Wagner would sometimes even say, we have a two-front war that we're fighting right now. There's the spiritual front, where we are trying to battle back these territorial spirits, the demonic forces that hold sway over America. And there's the natural front, where we are trying to enact the seven mountains in culture and in society and in politics, right? So those two things get woven together in this ideology, and that suddenly politics is not about, oh, well, we need to find compromises. We need to let's talk it out. Okay, you think that we should have no regulations on abortion, and I think it should be at 6 weeks. Let's compromise on 16 weeks, right? That's how democratic politics traditionally work.
Sure.
If it's about cosmic combat, if your position is inspired by the devil and you are just a puppet of demons, why would I negotiate with you?
Yeah.
Why would I compromise on anything? Right.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this in our politics today, the politics of spiritual warfare, and this hyper aggressive vision of spiritual warfare layered into politics is radicalizing all these folks to believe that there is no room for compromise. And if you can't compromise in a democracy, you can't have a democracy.
Yeah.
So those are the two first pieces. The third is what I would call a form of spiritual authoritarianism, but it takes a particular form in the NAR. What I would call—
Repeat again the NAR.
New Apostolic Reformation.
Yep.
Again, this is a movement that gets started under Peter Wagner in the 1990s and becomes very influential. And I would call it a spiritual oligarchy model of church leadership, where Wagner says there are apostles and prophets who have come to revive the church, and those apostles and prophets are generals of spiritual warfare. They carry special authority, and they in many ways replace all the layers of church governance above the level of the individual congregation. And so the individual congregations look to their apostle as their spiritual leader and invest that single person with this immense amount of spiritual authority. And then those apostles and prophets band together and create an oligarchy, where in an oligarchy, right, there's power sharing among these different leaders. There's an echelon of leaders, and they share things, right? They divide up society, and so that it's not them competing and fighting civil wars with each other. They're collaborating, and they're all participating in a system. That's how this kind of apostolic and prophetic governance, at least in this NAR model, works. And so the folks who are attaching themselves to the style of spirituality, the style of church governance, have already become spiritually authoritarian.
Yeah.
right? And so when someone like Trump comes along, A, the apostles and prophets see this great affinity with Trump, and B, the people in their communities and congregations are already conditioned to
Hmm.
look for authoritarian solutions to governance problems.
Sure.
Right? This is what they've been doing in their communities for decades. And Trump just comes and operates the same way in the political realm.
Hmm.
They're already kind of ready to jump on board, especially when their apostles and prophets are saying, I have a prophecy that says that God is Donald Trump's anointed
Yeah.
president. And that is what fueled January 6th. Was by the time you had the 2020 election, you had hundreds of these charismatic prophets all saying in chorus, all saying in unison, I received an individual prophecy, and Donald Trump is anointed to have a second term.
Mm.
And when Donald Trump refused to concede the 2020 election, almost all of these prophets refused to recant their prophecies.
Mm.
And they all said that we need God to intervene now. Because
Mm.
God wanted Trump, the demons stole the election from Trump, and now we need to do spiritual warfare, and we need to see these prophecies fulfilled.
Mm.
Because it's God's will that Donald Trump be president. It's not God's will for Biden to be president. And we need to enact the will of God on earth. And at that point, there's no consideration of democracy anymore.
Mm. Mm.
Because it's all become spiritual warfare for them.
Yeah. Ernie, my producer, sends me a note here that I want to throw out for you to take a look at. We are in a position where we are trying to negotiate with people who do not want a functioning government. They don't want to rebuild the bridge that collapsed. How can we ring the alarm on the existential threat that a second Trump term filled with these new apostolic reformists poses to our democracy? And I guess, again, I don't want to draw historical parallels that are not true or good analogies, but having watched the Shah of Iran replaced with the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Shah, of course, was not a Democrat and didn't believe in democracy, but it seems to me that none of these religiously inspired apostolic reformational type movements, when it in the Islamic community, have worked out well for that religion. And I think that, we have yet to see what happens in India with the rise of this Hindu nationalist movement, which is sort of similar in some ways. I know that you're a student of history as well as theology. There's nothing new under the sun. And living in the Bay State colony here myself, having seen, how quickly that divisiveness between pastors who started disagreeing, a lot of little mini denominational civil wars, Quakers being persecuted and whipped. If you want to fast forward to the interface between Donald Trump and these people, if they continue to go the way they're going and put him back in power somehow, aside from the fact that it's very bad for our democracy and perhaps terminal, Ernie's question of how do we work with this in terms of countering this, and I'll throw one more little note in terms of the media that I'm aware of. I read 7 newspapers a day, and I listen to things, from the BBC to NPR and all the rest, and I'm pretty well read on these things. I very rarely hear anybody in what might loosely be called the mainstream media talking about the actual issues, for instance, of how Hispanic Christianity is now part of the problem. Whether these folks are brown or of color or not, they're not on the side of democracy when it comes to how they're voting within this movement. I think there's a lack of honesty in looking at this, and I think part of it is that we lack the historical root and information to make parallels. Unless I've completely read everything wrong my whole life, this doesn't end well. And I just want your take on how you see this rolling out and what historical comparisons we have, because, all of these things have been tried before and they've not ended well for anybody as far as I can see. In other words, let's have a pitch for democracy with all its messiness made in the light of where this stuff goes and how this interfaces with prophetically predicted leaders like Trump in an authoritarian position. It's like, what? Do people understand how this plays out and what it means for not individual liberties in some theoretical sense, but everyday life in America? This is not good news. And it's not good news globally because we are a power that matters. Whether we believe in everything we do is right or not isn't the point. But it just seems to me that, this is sort of if Vladimir Putin sat down and said, what are the three things I could do that would quickly demolish American credibility and power globally? The second Trump presidency is one of them. And another thing would be for America to have a vast, well-supported theocratic movement coming from the charismatic movement that's truly interracial and cross-cultural, driving us, over a kind of a cliff. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but how do you see this actually playing out? If they succeed, or if they don't succeed? If they don't succeed, is this armed camps firing, shots at people? I mean, how does this play out? What are the scenarios here?
Yeah, now we've reached the part of the conversation, which is why I'm close to the cliff.
Yeah.
No, it's very dark, and I think that cosmopolitan.
Let's go to your phrase and just start here. Transnational Christian supremacist.
Yeah.
That's a really good phrase you put together. How does this play out if they win, lose, or draw? Just having this snake in the room slithering around biting us, how's this work? Do you stand on a chair? Do you try, what do you do?
Yeah.
I mean, it's loose and it's here.
Yeah. So I've spent the last 3 years of my life immersing myself in the 2020 election and in January 6th. And I know inside out how things went that year. We're in a worse place right now than we were in 2020. Obviously, we had COVID and George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protests in the streets in 2020. But if anything, that actually helped galvanize the country to recognize the seriousness of the 2020 election. Right? I think we recognized that it was all on the line. It was visceral and it felt desperate. And we are walking, especially cosmopolitan elites like you and I, are living with a sort of naivete or blasé attitude as we careen towards what I think could very well be a almost disastrous, if not absolutely disastrous, experience at the end of this year for American democracy. So here are the three scenarios that can happen in November. Scenario one is the election is so close between Biden and Trump that they can't call it in November. It's the 2000 election where you're having recounts, right? Now imagine the 2000 election playing out in our polarized political environment with Donald Trump in the mix, right? It'd be chaos in the streets. That's scenario one. Scenario two is Donald Trump wins. And pardon my French, but we're all screwed.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Donald Trump wins, and the Project 2025 that you talked about, and if you think we're overstating it, go and read these documents.
Yeah.
Right? They are literally paving a pathway to an authoritarian takeover of America and the American government that would, if anything, gut the rule of law. And Donald Trump is he's an instinctual person, but look at where his instincts are going. He is in a much darker place than he was in 2016 or even in 2020. He is seeking retribution. He is angry, and he is vengeance embodied, right? And he has surrounded himself with a group of people. His original cabinet was a parade of horribles. But their instinct was to resist Trump for many things. Those people are all gone. They've been excommunicated from the MAGA movement. And now it is just loyalists and cynics and scrappers who are surrounding Trump. And they are much more politically savvy. So the third scenario is that Joe Biden wins. And my question is, can you imagine Donald Trump conceding the 2024 election? Can you imagine him just in his personality saying, yep, I lost. Fair enough. Me and my MAGA people, we're going to go recede into the hinterlands. We're fine. No. He was willing to push everything to the brink on January 6th because he wanted 4 more years of living in the White House.
And now, in addition to which, he wants to stay out of prison.
Absolutely. And so I don't know that there's any scenario where we get out of 2024 unscathed. So the question is, how do we prepare ourselves for this, right? Because I've not written off American democracy. I think we need to stand and fight for it. But so here's my approach. First, I think we need to get educated about the growth of Christian supremacy and Christian extremism.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to put out different resources through articles. We put together a 25-minute documentary. If you want just the cliff notes of what I'm talking about, go to YouTube. It's called Spiritual Warriors. It's under my employer's YouTube channel, ICJS, the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. It's titled Spiritual Warriors: Decoding the Christian Nationalism of the Capitol Riot. And it's just 25 minutes of understanding who were the New Apostolic Reformation leaders and what did they do around the Capitol riot and why did they
and just speaking to Ernie here, not only will we link to that, Ernie, but let's dump it onto all of our sites. Let's put it everywhere so people can just watch it. If they're watching this anywhere, hearing it anywhere, we'll have it up and playing as well.
And if you want the 8-hour version of that with all the complexity, then listen to Charismatic Revival Fury. Just search Charismatic Revival Fury. It's on a podcast feed. You can listen to the whole thing for free. And then if you really want to go deep,
we will put all that up too.
Great. And my book is the biggest version of this, right? And
the book that's coming out.
Yes, it's coming out in September. If you pre-order it, you'll get it in August.
Yeah.
So get educated and spread the word to people, because I think, we are not locked in. We are not paying it close enough attention.
Yeah, and the book, by the way, again, is The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. And it's coming out this September. You can get it in August if you pre-order it. So that's everybody's homework. And we'll make that one of our book club offerings. In our book club, we have a thing called It Has to Be Read, and we will offer it the second it's out. So that will also show up again here, and we will have you back to talk about that as part of the book launch. So yeah, we're going to do all of that. Let me just ask you, as we're doing this, with those three scenarios, is there any awareness in what I would call the general media, other than people like me who have enough background to at least ask you intelligent questions and help set up what you're saying? Are there people out there who have access to larger audiences, or what we would call mainstream media? I don't see the long pieces in the New Yorker or wherever that do this. Have you written something of substance, for instance, for the Atlantic or the Wall Street Journal, or aside from the book, who out there in intelligent talking, writing, thinking, commentating kind of people is picking up on some of this? Because, just from my own point of view, what Matthew is talking about, Matthew Taylor, this is the world I grew up in. Of anybody talking to Matthew today, I probably have enough background to understand more of what he's saying than 99% of anyone who would interview him. I'm not holding myself up for anything. I'm just saying that's because I lived there in that world. But what is the chance of making this discussion not some specialized moment between you and me, but taking it wide enough so people look at this charismatic movement and what it's doing and what its ambition is for our democracy, which is to annihilate it and replace it with an authoritarian form of theocracy in a way, which I think, by the way, would lead to chaos. So they would not achieve their ends. They would just destroy us. That's my own analysis. Yeah, I mean, it's Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition all the way down, but it's the American version of it, with the guy trying to stay out of prison on top of it. So it's not like their win will achieve their ends. It's just going to achieve chaos. This is, being operated on by an incompetent surgeon. He will kill you. That's the problem, as I see it. How do you feel about that? Because it just seems to me that the closer they get to their goal, the more chaotic our culture becomes. It becomes dangerous to everybody. Not only is democracy in jeopardy, but our way of life becomes in jeopardy, because this is not what makes the gross national product thrive. This is not what gives anybody the rule of law to appeal to. The court system, as we understand it, loses all credibility in this. There are no checks and balances any further. A win for these folks does not mean that they get what they think they're after. A win means chaos and decline for our culture rapidly that we're all going to see in our lives, I think.
Yeah. Let me start with a media question. I talk to reporters multiple times a week, sometimes every day, who are trying to get stories right about this stuff. And it's a very, very difficult thing to get your arms around. Most reporters, most mainstream media reporters, if they have a religious background, have never studied religious studies, and have never studied religion with any formality. And the evisceration of the news media and of religion reporters, people for whom religion was their beat, means that a lot of the people who are now tasked with covering these things don't have a background in reporting on them.
Right.
So there's a lot of, and I do this, and I'm happy to do this. I try to help educate reporters, and even Charismatic Revival Theory. Many reporters have listened to Charismatic Revival Theory, this podcast series, and then they're following up on some of these things with their reporting in their own communities. And so I'm trying at the same time as I'm doing this to also produce resources for journalists who care about this stuff. So there is a lot of interest, and there are a lot of people, a lot of reporters who are trying to tell these stories. These are hard stories to tell in 1,000 or 2,000 words, right? Suddenly we're talking about apostles and prophets and 7 mountains and appeal to heaven flags and cosmic spiritual warfare, the capital right. Like at some point, your mind's so blown, and sometimes then you got to get to the actual story that you're writing, right? And so it's very, very difficult to tell these stories in cogent and coherent and succinct ways, but it's very important that we do so. And so I am seeing that momentum going on. The news media has got a lot of catching up to do on these stories, and they were not paying attention to the Christian nationalist mobilizing that went on before January 6th. In fact, they fell down on the job there. And I am trying to help them observe how that happened and correct that for 2024. But no, it's desperately important to get this information out there. And I've tried to write op-eds and pieces as well to try to break into some of those circles. In terms of what the U.S. would look like, I think we need to remember if you go back to the Reconstructionists, they were very systematic. They're very rational in their own way, right? I mean,
sure.
You can argue whether it's a rational conception of the world, but they were very, very systematic and rational in their way. The New Apostolic Reformation guys are not systematic. They're prophets. They believe that they are oracles, and they believe that they are hearing from God and speaking the words of God. And so they don't write policy white papers. They just go and try to attack abortion, or go and try to get people to support Israel, right? And so they are not thinking about the long-term consequences, because they believe that God is going to step in and resolve all the long-term questions.
Sure.
So they keep things in this fairly vague and hazy mode. But I'll just say, religious leadership, untethered from tradition, rooted in contemporary revelation and in charismatic authority, is only going to produce chaos in our society if it is empowered politically. Because they do not have a firm grasp of what it means to govern a nation, even an authoritarian nation. Right. And I get all these people who ask me, they're like, isn't this just the Christian version of Sharia? And I'm like, no. Sharia is very well thought out. Sharia is just the Islamic legal discourse. And you've had hundreds, thousands of scholars working over millennia to iron out what about protection for religious minorities? What does that look like? And then hammering that out in all kinds of different situations and coming up with principles and interpretations to do that. Sharia is a system that is very well thought out and very cultivated, like any legal system that exists for centuries. These folks are not doing the Christian version of Sharia.
Speaking of which, how do they interface with things like Project 2025? Because it would seem to me that the guys running the Heritage Foundation are systematic, and they're raising hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, to prepare as a shadow cabinet, as it were, to use the British analogy from Parliament, that when they step into power, they're not going to let Trump bumble around. They're going to dominate his presidency and make sure that these 50 things are done. Their lists are all being published now, what they want. Some of them with 1,000-page books, literally backing up individual areas, 1,000-page book on how we implement pro-life policy, 1,000-page studies on how we deconstruct Social Security and Medicare and get rid of it altogether. They are thinking systematically. How do they jump into power when Trump becomes president, dominate his presidency, and yet use these prophets and apostles to give them that power? And then what happens to the prophets and apostles once they put these authoritarian right-wingers into the driver's seat in the US, who have a much more systematic view of how you undermine the democracy and undermine the federal government and restructure the Justice Department and abolish the FBI and do all the things they're going to do so that they don't have to answer to anyone? Yeah. So how do these two movements, how do these multi-millionaire with some billionaire backings fit together with these loose cannon prophet seers, but who have millions of followers globally? How do these two things come together, and what sort of threat does that pose in terms of just where we're living when this is all over with?
Let me use the analogy of the Republican Party. Right? The Republican Party had an establishment.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump brought his figures, his types, the Steve Bannon, Michael Flynn, Roger Stone types, the marginal wackadoos of the old religious right or the old right. He brought them into power.
Yeah.
Right. And changed the culture of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
So today it is the Trump party. It's the MAGA party. But the think tanks, the organs of the old Republican Party found ways to accommodate that populist surge and integrate their agenda into it. The same thing is happening with the religious right. So Donald Trump brings the apostles and prophets and the independent charismatics and the televangelists into the catbird seat in the religious right. The Paula Whites and the Lance Wallnows, right? Those are now the people who are the face of Christian Trumpism. But they're the populists. And the establishment is still the Council for National Policy, right? These kind of umbrella network organizations of the religious right. They still are controlling the policy agenda, more or less.
Yeah.
Right? Because they are the people who do write white papers. They are the people who do write 1,000-page booklets on how do you basically eviscerate and recreate the US government.
Yeah. Right? Or get rid of Medicare.
And frankly, as long as they're fighting abortion and giving the apostles and prophets free reign and supporting Israel and doing everything that the apostles and prophets ultimately care about, they don't care about being the policy people. They're happy being the populists. Yeah. Right. But they are the ones who
give them a pro-life win once in a while, roll back gay rights here, go after trans people, make abortion pills illegal, or whatever. Just give them that stuff and then they'll be happy. Then we can get on with the real business of transforming America into an authoritarian government that rolls back everything since the New Deal.
Yeah, they're not the NAR leaders are not thinking about tax policy. Right. They're not thinking about the federalism and all. Like they have this cosmic agenda. Yeah. And as long as their senses that, and this is what Donald Trump did for them in his term, was he gave them the sense that their cosmic agenda was being fulfilled. And so they didn't care about the rest of his policies. They could make peace somehow internally with children in cages at the border. Yeah. Because they felt Donald Trump was right on Israel. Because they felt Donald Trump gave them what they wanted on abortion. Yeah. Right. And so for the causes they care about, they'll pay attention to. And the rest of it, Well, they're just seeking the spiritual renewal of all societies.
Well, and
They
one thing
conform.
with God will solve our problems, of course, is not going to fix our environmental catastrophe that's unfolding,
Yep.
irrespective of who's in power, in terms of just what's really out here, uh, whatever we say. So you've got this sort of butting up against reality that you saw in the anti-vax movement, where people actually died. You know, tens of thousands of evangelical Christians who refused to get vaccinated died. They wouldn't mask up, they wouldn't get vaccine, they died. And now we've got an environmental movement that will be completely stymied if these guys get into power, because as I understand it, correct me, please jump in, but my view is that these apostolic types don't care about this, or they think God will somehow solve it. If we bring justice on earth to, you know, the unborn, whatever, God will step in. If the U.S. embassy is in Jerusalem and not in Tel Aviv, God will bless because of this in this Bible verse. The people writing the white papers are also anti-environmentalists because they are the shills of the oil companies and the GDP. So what happens to environmental protection in this scenario? What happens to the forward steps we've got just in that one area? How does that play out with the chaos and not caring and God will solve it on one end, and then the people at Heritage Foundation who are writing the 1,000-page booklets on how we deconstruct the Department of Education and Welfare or deconstruct the Environmental Protection Agency? You know, how do those two worlds fit together, and what do they produce in terms of the chaos you're talking about?
Well, all forms of nationalism are antithetical in many ways to doing something collectively on the environment, right? Because nationalism turns the gaze inward and says the real people, the important people, are the people inside my borders. And I don't care about those other people. And honestly, Frank, it gets worse than that, because the dominoes of climate change have already started to fall.
Sure.
Right? We are seeing worse and worse weather patterns. We are seeing rising sea levels. There are many communities globally that are going to be displaced by climate change.
Yeah.
And that, I'm not an expert on global migration or climate change, but from what I read from the experts who do study that stuff, that is going to create a global migration crisis. Because people are going to have to leave coastal areas and places that have become functional deserts because they of climate change.
And by the way, that includes 2/3 of the U.S. population.
Yeah.
I live there. I mean, I'm right here north of Boston on the coast, and my potato patch was swept away today by a high tide combined with a northeaster. I've been in the same house for 43 years, and every year the water gets a little higher and there's a stand of trees dying. And this isn't even on the coast. This is just on a tidal estuary of a river.
And that migration crisis, right, is only going to amplify the impulse towards different forms of nationalism. People are going to want to protect their borders. People are going to protect what they have. Right? Not just in the U.S. That's going to happen globally. Migration, this force for globalization, this force for transformation, is also very threatening to many established orders. And so that impulse towards more nationalistic fervor, I think, is going to increase as climate change gets worse. And so I really do think we are entering into a period of human history, not just American history, but human history, that requires pluralistic thinking.
Sure.
Requires democratic organizing and collaboration, even as we are entering into a moment that is extremely polarized ideologically, socially, sociologically, economically. And the question, the existential question in many ways, is, can we draw on the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln put it? Can we call upon the instincts that we have towards collaboration? Because those instincts are there. The instincts towards conflict are there in our nature, but the instincts towards collaboration, cooperation, dialogue are also there. And can we draw upon those better angels of our nature that we can learn from each other? We can work together to solve these things. I'm worried that we aren't in that headspace collectively right now.
And
But
just
that's
one evidence of your worry being justified. And again, I draw on my producer Ernie, send me a note, but it's a good one here. Well, they're always good, but I think an evidence of what you're talking about is the frivolity with which we treat, for instance, third-party candidates who can basically further prosecute the chance that Trump is elected by cutting into Biden. Whether it's Kennedy or somebody else, we saw these marginal leads diminish when Hillary was running because of certain Green parties and so forth, which brings up a kind of a question that I would ask you. In this context, it seems to me when I read about politics in America, you have two huge failings in terms of addressing this. Well, three. One is not doing what you're talking about, which is collaboration, which goes back into the evolutionary prime directive that a lot of researchers now say was never the survival of the fittest, but always the survival of the friendliest. The people who made it were the ones who knew how to cooperate with each other, all the way back into hunter-gatherers. We've only had 5% of human existence in our, what we call the modern era, say post the biblical era, the last 2,000 years, Roman imperial. Before that, it's all hunter-gatherer, and you died. If you didn't share what you gathered, you were dead. So the whole lesson of evolution is to do what you're talking about, irrespective of various religious teaching. But then, when you come up into our present era, the very fact that there are younger people out there who are saying they may not vote because they have the bone to pick with Biden over this or that issue, or they're just going to sit it out, or both parties are the same, or they're going to vote for the Green Party, or they're going to, they're following a celebrity like Kennedy. It's very disheartening because if we're facing what you're talking about, which I completely agree with what you're saying, by the way, in case anybody's wondering, because I'm sitting here doing a lot of listening as well as setting some questions up, I'm a 100% agreement with Matthew Taylor on this, and you're explaining things, in a way that I would love to see explained here on this podcast. So this is a great service to me. But in addition to which, I'm disheartened not just by the media's inability to play catch up and take religion seriously, which I've been calling them to do now for the last 35, 40 years after I left the evangelical community, saying, the Persians are coming, as it were. They're on the way. These guys are serious. Watch out. It's taken a form that I did not foresee with this charismatic movement. I thought it was going to be the Rushduni types and their people. But
they're still around.
They're still around. But how do we cut through? And I won't call it apathy. But how do we cut through this entertain ourselves to death miasma of distraction and just say, wake the fuck up? If we don't have Joe Biden and a Democratic majority, here's what the future holds. And even if we do elect him, we're going to be in a huge fight for this country for a long time with people who, because they think God has led them to adopt this prophetic model, will refuse to accept this election. This is really serious shit. I don't know, we do our podcasts, we do these things. I mean, what's the good word on that? Because this is really, 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 really chips are down, all hands on deck. This is it. And I don't know how to say it more stridently than I'm already saying it without sounding like a complete lunatic.
I'm not a partisan. I'm an independent registered. I voted for, as an evangelical, I voted for George W. Bush twice and then Barack Obama twice, right? I really and truly believe that there are wonderful things about American culture and about American history and about the American project. It's a beautiful project and is worth fighting for, and is worth preserving. The best instincts of our project, the instincts towards pluralism, of the instincts towards equality for all people, the instincts towards welcoming wave after wave after wave of migrants who have brought incredible diversity and beauty to our culture. I think that's worth fighting for. And so I guess what I try to tell people is, where's your bright line? And you need to figure that out. Because in 2020, part of the reason January 6th could happen was the Christian right, both the charismatic and the conventional Christian right, is very good at putting people in the streets.
Mm.
And people in the streets are sometimes what it takes to save or topple a democracy. And so I was not in the streets. I mean, I went to Black Lives Matter's protest, but I was not in the streets in November or December or January of 2021. And I'm an egghead. I'd much rather just be reading and writing books and sitting in libraries, right? But I've had to think through what are my bright lines? What would I be willing to go out and fight for? Not violently. If we come to violence, that is also potentially the end of democracy, right? So what would I be willing to protest for? Would I be willing to show up for? And I think we are coming to those times here in 2024 and early 2025 where those bright lines are going to get crossed for many of us. And I think we need to find ways to defend democracy, find ways to resist the rising tide of authoritarianism. And that might mean danger. That might mean some real personal consequences for many of us. But that's what it means to live in a democracy. You have to defend that democracy against, because democracy is not easy. It never has been, and it's never stable, right? Because democracy is about finding ways to balance among diverse people in society, finding ways to share power. And democracy has an Achilles heel in authoritarianism and fascism, because authoritarians and fascists can use the machinery of democracy to come to power.
Once.
And that's all that it has to do, is just once.
They use it once, and then they stay in power. So
democracy is a vigil. And I've used this analogy before, but in some ways, the situation we're in now, democracy is a spinning top, right? It maintains a certain balance. And the chaos factor right now is you have people like Trump or Bannon or Michael Flynn or Roger Stone or the NAR apostles and prophets who have come to the conclusion that their best way to power is to throw themselves against the side of this top that we're all standing on, to destabilize that spin, to disrupt the mechanisms and the virtues of democracy so that they can claim power. And it's working, right? The top is wobbling.
And some of them are being funded by people with billions of dollars who are kind of part of a tech brotherhood that is into hyper individualism, hyper egotistical quests of personal fulfillment, combined with the idea that somehow, they may not believe in the prophetic vision of the charismatic Christian, but they regard themselves as oracles of great wisdom that are going to mold the future. And, they've had a couple shots at it already. And look what it's done to teenagers in America since 2011, when everybody traded in their flip phone for a smartphone, and the levels of depression and anxiety just terms of foretastes of the kind of chaos that sort of elitism brings when it's not balanced by anything. Some of these guys are backing the movements you're talking about, not religiously, but they also are chaos agents, believing that they are isolated from the chaos by their billions and will somehow reap the future. So there's another stream there as well of the big money in tech, and they're not all monolithic, but these people exist as well.
And I got this from Jim Wallace, who's become a friend. He talks about we need to decide who are the people we can persuade and the people we must defeat. And I think that actually the realm of persuasion is bigger than a lot of us might assume, living in our own little silos. I mean,
I agree.
We always have to recognize the people on the other side are people, right? They're human beings. They want to put food on the table for their children. Want peace. They want calm, right? They don't want chaos, even if they're voting for the chaos candidate. right? And so I think we need to be in the business of persuasion. We also
Mm.
need to have a line that says, I don't think I've talked to a number of these NAR apostles and prophets in the course of my research. They're not persuadable,
No, they are not.
right? But that doesn't mean that all their followers
And I
are not
say the same
persuadable.
for some of the tech billionaires. I don't think are persuadable because they're so deep into their egomaniacal quest for power and longevity, even, in weird ways. Talk about weird stuff. I'm going to live till I'm 138. I'm on this special regime. I mean, we've got a number of people in our country who are seeking power, in ways that are very self-congratulatory from a secular side as well as a religious side.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how would you like to wrap this up? Because I want to leave people with a couple things they can do. I would urge, again, let me just sort of reintroduce and do my little wrap up, and then I'll give you the last word. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and this has been In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest has been Dr. Matthew Taylor, and Matthew is a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic and Christian and Jewish Studies, co-author with our friend Brad Onishi of Mike Johnson piece in Rolling Stone magazine that I read at the beginning of this talk. And he is the author of a book called The Violent Take It by Force, which will be available in August if you pre-buy it. And after that, will be coming out in September, subtitled The Christian Movement That is Threatening Our Democracy. And it's coming out this September. Does that book, because I have not read it yet, get me an advance copy, by the way, send me a PDF. I need to read it and start promoting it. But I'm presuming that it covers some of the material we've been discussing here.
Yeah. The book is about the New Apostolic Reformation, where it came from, who are the key leaders in it,
Yeah.
and how did that lead into January 6th, and what are these guys doing now? But it's also about these tectonic shifts that we've been living through in the leadership and culture of the religious right that has radicalized so many Christians around Donald Trump. But he's not the only catalyst for it. That is really destabilizing our politics and destabilizing our democracy.
So I would end by just asking you to wrap it up with whatever your last thoughts are. Before that, I would say please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts. And then to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com, and you can support what I'm doing by subscribing there. It's free, and or you can contribute. But the main point is we need more names and faces, because the algorithms on so many platforms are so weird that, for all I know, because somehow what we've said here crosses some algorithmic line, we could be banned for a month or something because it's just so odd. I mean, it's not people you're talking to, but they just, these strange social media things, and the Substack subscription is the way to kind of keep getting what we're saying. So how would you like to just end this in terms of what we're looking at besides buy the book? And we will have you back to talk about the book, but give us a final thought.
I do interreligious dialogue for a living. This is what
Yeah.
my day job is gathering groups of especially Christians and Jews and Muslims, but we also have a lot of people who don't affiliate with religion, but are really interested in dialoguing with religious people who come to our programs, who come to our courses, who participate in our fellowships. And there's something really powerful about encountering someone who has a totally different worldview than you and finding common humanity, finding real disagreement, right? But then also finding common humanity in places where we resonate, places where these very different ideas come close to each other. What we need right now, desperately, and we need it in the next 7 months,
Yes.
is a mobilization of intra-Christian dialogue. And I don't know about you, Frank. I still call myself a Christian. I still identify as a Christian. And we need Christians of good faith, because our different forms of American Christianity have become so siloed unto themselves. And we, I would say, are now in a moment in the United States that we have not seen this level of polarization, theological polarization, social polarization, and epistemic polarization in how we know what we know. That in American Christianity, we have not seen that since the eve of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so we desperately need Christians, especially Christians who identify as liberal or centrist, who look at this stuff and like, oh God, I don't want to touch that. You need to take responsibility.
Mm,
You need to take responsibility for what your fellow Christians are doing and saying in the name of Jesus, in the name of Christianity.
mm,
And we need to step up. And we need to engage in the very difficult theological conversations, the very difficult social conversations.
mm,
And we as Christians need to be on the front lines of de-radicalizing Christianity in America.
mm,
This is not somebody else's job. It's our job. And for
mm,
those other people who are not Christian, who are watching this in horror, please support those efforts and help join in to the degree that you can.
mm,
In many ways, what is so difficult about religious nationalism and religious supremacy is that it is dehumanizing.
mm, mm,
It dehumanizes the opponents. It dehumanizes people like us. And we have to be in the business of rehumanizing ourselves, claiming our own humanity, claiming our values, claiming our vision,
mm,
and then articulating that in a way that hopefully people can hear and be persuaded.
mm,
Because the people who showed up on January 6th were not imagining that their enemies were human beings. They were imagining they were demons.
mm, mm.
And the violence was licensed because they believed they were inflicting pain on Satan, not human beings.
Mm. Yeah. So we will leave it there. And Matthew Taylor, thank you so much. We will be pushing people to buy that book and get an advanced copy. We will make it part of our book club. And we will be ready to help you forward what you're talking about, including, by the way, send Ernie, my producer, the names of other guests you would like us to be talking to on this show, or anybody you would like to come back to an appearance with, like Brad or someone else, to restate some of these things, perhaps with 2 or 3 people at the same time. So please use us at It Has to Be Said, my commentary and or this podcast in conversation with Frank Schaeffer is just one of your means of communicating with people. We don't have another agenda. We're not selling stuff, Bibles or shoes or anything else. We just sort of talk, but we're here to help you put forward what I think is, without exaggeration, the most important thing we can be talking about right now, because all other bets are off. Environmental, gender, race, everything is a moot point compared to addressing this, because nothing else matters at that point, including environmental, because it ends if these guys come to power. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.